I'm also the co-chair for Article 6, so I have not slept since Thursday night, or gone home since Thursday night. And we were on the podium, and I see now I'm being called to the subdisciplinary as well. But I feel a little, I'm used to being in a room where I know a lot of the people, and I know the topic better than most of them. I am unusually not in that situation at all right now, because I'm a carbon pricing expert rather than a finance expert. And I do always find it strange that those things are often so different from one another. That may not be a great thing for the world. But as I said, I'm doing Article 6. A year ago, I wrote a paper with Ian Perry at the IMF and Dirk Hein at the World Bank and Tristan Smith at UCL, who does a lot of work on maritime, about carbon taxation for international maritime fuels. So nice segue with the tax. The paper's sometimes not so popular, but for those of you that don't know, the IMO made a pledge to reduce emissions by at least 50% below 2008 by 2050. And they're now developing their strategy to get there. And they're considering many options in the toolbox, carbon pricing being one of them. So Ian, mostly the lead author in this paper, looked at how a carbon tax could apply to maritime. So, I mean, basically they're looking at measures for fuel efficiency or ship efficiency, which is measures they've already produced. And then there are some options of how to apply carbon pricing mechanisms to shipping. Shipping is a very complicated industry. Applying emissions trading might be tricky because of how ships are owned and rented and everything else. So Ian's paper basically says that one of the most straightforward options would be a carbon tax, right? A straight carbon tax on shipping. He's explored two options for that, one being a standard carbon tax. He suggests a price of $75 a ton. I know that carbon prices in the world aren't currently at that, looking at more like, between 10 and 30 and rising. But I think he was basing his price more on the social cost of carbon found in the Stern-Stiglitz report that looks more at like $100 to $150 necessary to internalize the cost of climate change. So 75 in that price range seems quite moderate. It also is not terribly far off some of the costs of sulfur that are already being imposed on maritime. And as you know, when it comes to the price of oil, that's not a huge amount per ton. He modeled out all the analysis and found that technical efficiency standards are significantly less effective than a tax or an emissions trading scheme. He looked also at an offset scheme, which is what was created for aviation, CORSIA, under ICAO, and he found that it's more effective than technical efficiency standards, but the problem is the offset price. It's highly uncertain. And it doesn't generate any revenue, right? The emissions trading system can be designed quite like a tax and earn a lot of revenue, but as I said, it can be quite complicated to implement. And the bigger problem is, as we know, from the carbon price can be quite low without price floors. So also the revenue stream isn't as certain. Ian then looked at designing a global tax applied to maritime. And as you say, there are other examples of international levies or tax. Share of proceeds, a subject I've dealt with an awful lot this week, is one. And so it's not impossible. In fact, the industry is calling for a fuel levy. The shipping industry is calling for a fuel levy as opposed to emissions trading. The industry are also putting pressure for all revenue to be used within the sector. But Ian's analysis shows that it would be nearly impossible for the sector to actually efficiently absorb that kind of revenue. But you can use the revenue for other purposes, such as looking at those most impacted. So shipping is obviously the concern is that it would impact trade. 60% of goods loaded and unloaded are loaded and unloaded in developing countries. You have a high impact on small and developing states, and you could set aside revenue to try and offset those impacts. He also looked at a revenue neutral tax where you would tax the difference between CO2 per trip and CO2 average ship, right? So it's revenue neutral, it doesn't actually earn revenue, but it still has a significantly higher environmental impact than the efficiency standards. Ian always uses these spreadsheet tools. I don't know if you've read Ian's papers before, but in the paper you can see his methodology and the kind of elasticities he's used for the sector and other things. When it comes, I wish I could show you the slide, but sorry. So when it comes down to it, he's found that CO2 as a percent below BAU, with either the carbon tax or the carbon neutral revenue, revenue neutral tax, you get about a gigaton of reductions. Whereas with the efficiency standards, you're looking at half that, right, by 2050. If you did a straight tax, a normal tax, you could raise up to 155 billion US dollars. So it's a significant amount of revenue, and that's what he's talking about, the absorption in sector. And then in terms of cost cost as a percentage of GDP, it's like not 0.16% of GDP. So it's not a huge cost if you have a tax at that level. I mean, obviously some of the biggest problems are the barriers in terms of a tax, how to the administrative function for an international tax, and just the acceptance of an international tax. But in the shipping industry don't want to be the cash cow for climate finance. That's clear. But nonetheless, if you actually just look at the numbers, it pans out quite well. And the IMO are currently considering this toolbox. So happy to take questions on that or Article 6 or whatever you want to talk about. It's the only thing that's in my mind right now.